thanks, Thomas, for this really nice introduction. So many words about myself. I feel a little ashamed, and I hope I can pay back your gratitude with this lecture. May I first ask if I can share my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, then I will do that. Okay, I think you should see this now. Is that okay? Okay, then welcome everybody, dear colleagues, dear students. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to this conference and for the honor to introduce this event with a lecture this evening. This is not an easy task, as unlike most of you, I'm, as you heard, not an archaeologist or a historian myself. On the other hand, as you also just heard, I have been able to gain a lot of experience in interdisciplinary work over the past years. And I have thought extensively about the topic that is the focus of our conference, namely resources. I understand the fact that the organizers of this academic event asked me, the anthropologist, to give this introductory lecture as a kind of invitation to present results from my long-standing collaboration with archaeologists and historians. At the same time, I suspect that the organizers of this conference expect from such a lecture marking the beginning of the event some more, let's say, fundamental conceptual considerations that might provide food for reflection for a majority of the participants beyond their concrete fields of research. Accordingly, I have prepared a lecture that brings these two aspects together. I would like to report to you today on how this major interdisciplinary project Thomas just mentioned on resource cultures, in which I was and still am involved, has developed. In particular, the concepts we have developed in connection with the study of resources. Thomas just mentioned some of them. I would like to start by saying that in this interdisciplinary project, one of course finds different approaches and positions, and that its members certainly do not share a completely unified viewpoint. On the contrary, our network lives, of course, precisely from different opinions and discourses. So what I'm presenting today is therefore essentially my own view of the most important insights from these discourses, in which I have been very involved since the project was established. Essentially, I will deal with the following issues and concepts today. First, I will discuss more or less conventional definitions of resources. Second, introduce what I have called the resource term. Third, introduce the idea of resource complexes. Fourth, explain the concept of resource assemblages. And then finally, introduce the key term of our overall project, resource cultures. On the one hand, I will try to convey to you which considerations led to these concepts. On the other hand, how I think they can be applied to concrete examples. So, resources are what move societies. With this idea in mind, a collaborative research center, in German we call that SFB, on the topic of resources began at the University of Tübingen in 2013. In the meantime, this SFB has successfully completed 2 funding phases and is currently in the process of applying for the 3rd phase. In 2 weeks we have to submit. I myself was involved from the very beginning, as Thomas said, first as a member of a small group which developed the basic ideas for this center, then as a member of its executive board, and finally, since moving to Frankfurt, as a principal investigator. The center, which is presently headed by the prehistorian Martin Bartelheim, I guess most of you know him, and the geomorphologist Thomas Scholten, comprises more than 60 scientists, mainly archaeologists, but also ethnologists, geographers, historians, philologists, economic historians, and so on. The starting point of the research initiative was the observation that the concept of resources as prevalent in the natural and economic sciences has not been systematically questioned in our subjects, in the humanities or the cultural sciences, although it raises a number of questions. For example, how did the term resources come into being? What ideas does the term imply? Can the term also be used for prehistoric or ancient society? And is there a comparable concept in other contemporary cultures? A look at the genesis of today's concept of resources shows that the prevailing understanding of resources in the plural as raw materials from nature probably first developed in Europe during the period of industrialization. According to Hausmann and Perrault, you find the reference here at the bottom of the slide, who conducted research on the origin of the word in another SFB on resources here in Frankfurt. The word resource is, as you probably know, derived from the Latin verb resurgo or resurgere. While this term was initially associated with war and astronomy in Roman texts, from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD onwards, it was mainly used in connection with the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the belief in his ascension to heaven. This meaning of the term remained dominant until the Middle Ages, but was gradually, so to say, associated with the concepts of saving the soul, spiritual renewal, and overcoming a crisis. Specifically, it referred to Christ himself, to the transitoryness of the flesh, and to the possibility of resurrection from the dead. From the middle of the 18th century onwards, however, there was, according to these authors, a radical change. The number of uses of the term resource increased considerably in all texts, while at the same time, it appeared much more frequently in the plural form. In short, while the singular, it is resource, referred to a characteristic or inner qualities of the human being, the plural, it is resources, began to refer to things and especially to objects derived from nature. Although these authors do not draw this conclusion, the shift of meaning from, so to say, spirit to substance, nevertheless, in my view, preserves a continuity, namely the reference to the ground. In my interpretation, the meaning shifts from the resurrection of the soul from the grave to the extraction of raw material from the ground. Hausmann and Perrault argue that this conceptual shift was also accompanied by economic exchange, because the accumulation of resources began, as you know, to define capital. In the centuries that followed, so the 19th and 20th century, they argue the word resource underwent an increasing expansion, closely linked to global industrialization, capitalism, and of course, commercialization. From an internal quality, resources became something external. First, resources were phenomena of nature, then of economy, then of culture and religion, and today resources are spoken of in almost all areas of life. Even a quick glance at magazines and newspapers confirms the unlimited use of the term resources in modern society. We have human resources, spiritual resources, cinematic resources, and even erotic resources, to name but a few. To this day, however, the view of resources as natural raw materials such as ores, wood, water, gas, or oil, which are used for the production of goods, is an important part of most economic definitions of resources. Sometimes the term natural resources is used for these raw materials necessary for human production, and thereby distinguished from cultural resources which are produced by humans. The idea, however, of production is key to a modern understanding of resources. For example, the International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences states that, I quote here, "A resource is anything of value as an input in production." And in this way, classical political economy identified land, labor, and capital as the three factors of production, and in this way is distinguished between natural resources, human resources, and financial resources. In the economic sciences, resources used for production are sometimes simply defined by their scarcity, but one also comes across more differentiated approaches. For example, Müller-Christ distinguishes between resource definitions in the context of what he calls production theory, competition theory, and systems theory. In the first case, it is production theory. Resources are primarily production factors. In the second case of competition theory, they are organizational prerequisites for economic success. And in the third case, systems theory, they are manifold means of maintaining systems. The basic distinction here is between tangible or material resources, such as land, machines, or capital, and intangible or immaterial resources, such as knowledge, relationships, structures, and so on. A recurrent idea contained in all these definitions is that resources are the means to achieve certain goals. This, what I would call functionalist perspective, has been, as argued by Hausmann and Perrault, applied over time to all areas of human life, from politics to society, from culture to religion. However, I argue that in the course of this semantic expansion of the term, its economic roots were only partially overcome in our subjects. The work of Pierre Bourdieu, in particular his theory of the varieties of capital, was, I think, decisive in this. For Bourdieu, as you all know, resources are the basis of the various types of capital, economic, social, cultural, symbolic, which can be converted into one another and depend very much on social networks. Bourdieu defines social capital as, I looked it up and I quote, the sum of resources that accrue to an individual or group by virtue of possessing a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition. This understanding of resources as capital has, I think, gone hand in hand with the strong influences of economic approaches on theories in the humanities and social sciences. One may only think of methodological individualism, rational choice theories, and sociological functionalism. In this line of thinking, resources of all kinds are usually considered scarce, are the capital of an individual or group. They can be accumulated and should be used rationally to serve the individual or society by meeting needs or maintaining structures. Now, from the perspective of this SFB, of this center, this concept of resources fits very well into a modern industrial society that is geared towards production and consumption, and in which market economy principles have an impact on all spheres of life. Such an economic understanding of resources is the product of a society in which, as Louis Dumont would term it, the relationship between men and things is higher value than the relationship between men. It also corresponds with a society that values the individual higher than anything else, and in which associations of such individuals are primarily created by production, distribution, and consumption of things. But what would be a suitable concept of resources for studying societies that have different values, have other visions of sociality, and in which non-capitalist forms of economy exist? In other words, what are both the means and the ends of people who lived in pre-industrial times, or whose existence is not entirely shaped by capitalist market economy even today? These initial questions initiated a search for a different understanding of resources in our center and finally led to the demand for a resource turn. It is a fundamental reformulation of the resource concept from a cultural studies perspective. And I include archaeology, history, and anthropology in this. A glance at the existing literature in our subjects showed that there was hardly any critical discussion of the concept of resources in our subjects. In recent years, we have observed an increased interest in cultural resources, triggered in particular by the UNESCO conventions on world cultural heritage, or document heritage, as Thomas just mentioned, and the intangible cultural heritage of humanity, which is strongly rooted in concepts of European modernity, as Benedikt Hemme and Tauschek argue. On the other hand, I am not aware of many cultural study debates on the concepts of resource. There is, for example, no entry for resource in the work Cultural Theory, the Key Concepts from 2007, which covers over 350 key terms central to cultural theory today. And one finds no separate contribution on resources, for example, in the 3-volume Handbuch der Kulturwissenschaften, which comprises more than 1,500 pages. Neither Barnard and Spencer's updated all-encompassing ethnological encyclopedia of social and cultural anthropology, nor the latest edition from 2018, I think, of a dictionary of cultural anthropology with more than 400 keywords, does have its own entry on the subject of resources. In textbooks such as the DTV Atlas on Ethnology, which is widely used by students here in Germany, resources are treated quite conventionally under the headings environment and adaptation and economy. In Bachmann-Meding's relevant work on cultural turns, which you probably know, turns are addressed in many different subject areas, but not in relation to resources. So what could such a resource turn look like? From an anthropological perspective, the main argument is that resources should be understood as part of specific culturally shaped social orders. societies have their own resources, which they use for their own purposes. The handling of gold in today's India can serve as an example. In terms of total gold reserves, India ranks 11th in the world. And India is the largest consumer of gold worldwide, followed by China only. A large amount of this gold is stored in private households, and this can only be understood from the special importance of gold in the Hindu context. Gold is considered to be extremely pure. That means it represents a value that is fundamental to the hierarchy of the Indian caste system. It is mainly used in initiation rites, such as birth, in particular marriage rituals, weddings, which are crucial in India to express a person's social status, means caste affiliation, but also social class and ethnic identity. The gift of gold, as it is called, turns a young woman into a wife, creates long-term social obligations, and is, of course, an economically relevant investment for starting a new family. In short, gold is what David Graeber, you see the reference here at the bottom, calls a social currency. It is an investment to create community. And in the Hindu context, this includes the world of the gods. Gold is therefore also used in many temple rituals, is considered indestructible, and is therefore regarded as a suitable material for making images of gods from a Hindu perspective. So if societies have their own resources that fit their social or cosmological orders, as you have just seen, it can be argued that these societies are created, reproduced, and changed by these particular resources. But why do people in different societies choose very specific resources, and what determines the concrete ways of dealing with them? In order to understand this, the SFB placed cultural ideas, values, and practices. So ideas, values, and practices at the center of its investigation of resources. This cultural dimension, it is argued, influences the shaping of social order, provides an assessment of resources in relation to this order, and gives guidelines for the appropriate use of such resources. From this perspective, all resources, I mean, also including those commonly defined as material or belonging to nature, are cultural. It's inseparable. Why? Because they acquire their meaning within the framework of culturally shaped practical interests, as the American anthropologist Marshall Sahlins argued long ago in 1976, when arguing against, at that time, popular Marxist and materialist theories. This means that the choice of what is used to achieve certain goals and how it is used in practice depends on the cultural order in question. Sahlins explains this as follows, I quote, "This does not imply that we are forced to adapt an idealist alternative, conceiving culture as walking about on the thin air of symbols. It is not that the material forces and constraints are left out of account, or that they have no real effects on the cultural order. It is that the effects cannot be read from the nature of the forces, for the material effects depend on their cultural encompassment." End of quote. When resources in this sense acquire their value within the framework of cultural conceptions, they only superficially serve individual interests, because these interests are shaped by historically grown assemblage of things, knowledge, meanings, and values of certain human societies. Similarly, Stalin-inspired historian William Sewell Jr. argues in his work, Logics of History, I quote, you see it here, "It is clear then that resources can plausibly be thought of as effects of cultural schemas." As an example, I would like to refer to the valuation and use of millets in the highlands of Odisha in eastern India. For the Swidden cultivators in these highlands, among whom I did field research for 1.5 years, millets are much more than just a satisfying food. Their myths show that from their perspective, millet cultivation is closely linked to their origin, to their way of life, to their whole identity. The consumption of millets is linked to their ideas of a good life, because millets as festive gifts help to strengthen social relationships with friends, neighbors, agnates, and relatives. Millets are also much more than just raw materials, because millets are regarded as a representation of the gods and ancestors and of their power to give life. Those who have millets are rich, however, not only in the material sense, but also because millets stand for intact socio-cosmic relationships. Millets connect man with the living environment. These cultural ideas and actions are not rigid and unchangeable. On the contrary, they are subject to continuous change, which is sometimes induced precisely by the way these resources are handled. These resource dynamics are thus, on the one hand, the product of very specific cultural and social orders, and on the other hand, they contribute to their change. This dual movement. Our SFB applies this general idea to 3 specific dimensions of human existence. It is time, space, and what you could call imagination. This led to the creation of 3 project areas which provide an overall framework for all the projects. These are development, Entwicklungen, focuses on social processes of groups and institutions. Then the project area named Bewegungen, movement, looks at dynamics in space, for example, migration or colonization. And the project area termed Bewertungen, valuations, you might call it in English, or assessments, deals with the change in cultural meanings, especially in symbolism and representation in relation to resources. This reconceptualization of resources from a cultural point of view triggered a number of constructive academic debates within and outside our research network, which over time led to a further sharpening of the resource definition. The question arose, for example, as to whether everything is a resource according to this approach, and how it would be possible under these circumstances to decide which resource should be the focus of our research. This drew the attention to the socio-cultural values, or what might call the hierarchy of resources. So in a concrete society, the argument goes, there are always material as well as immaterial resources that are of particular importance for the creation, the preservation, and the transformation of social relationships and identities. Such highly valued resources are often the subject of a lot of intensive work and attention by society as a whole. So you see that these resources are protected, sacralized, processed, deposited, displayed, converted, and so on. In the archaeological sciences in particular, this approach offers access to culturally relevant resources because even if written sources are lacking, the material finds show this special appreciation of resources. So depots have been established, large tomb complexes built, architectural measures taken to preserve the resources, fortifications built to protect them, or various artistic forms developed to represent them. It is these culturally relevant resources of concrete societies that the center is particularly concerned with. However, this raises the question of whether there are not also resources that play a central role not only in specific societies, but, as many of our critics argued, fundamentally in all human populations, such as the air to breathe, the food to eat, or water to drink. There are not things, both material and immaterial, we were asked, which satisfy universal needs and are therefore resources, means have a value for life completely independent of culture. So a really strong critique against the whole approach. In view of this critique, my suggestion is to take into account the distinction between function and means. For example, food certainly has the function of ensuring the preservation and reproductive capacity of society worldwide and at all times. But this function can be achieved by various means. And it is the latter, it is the resources actually used that we are interested in. It is historical processes, means events through time, that determine which food and which beverages are considered valuable and how they are handled. Even the air we breathe is not simply there. This was hard to argue, especially with archaeologists. People all over the world had and still have different ideas about what air is. They differentiate between different types of air and develop their own ways of dealing with air, depending on their cultural orientation. They nowadays, especially in Corona times, filter it for improvement or modify it by fragrances. Air is compressed in oxygen cylinders for diving or for the treatment of the sick. And Indian ascetics have developed their own breathing techniques to achieve spiritual salvation through meditation. Another question which arises in this context is if resources must necessarily be used. From the above mentioned considerations, it follows that the answer is, of course, yes, for us at least, because resources are, on the one hand, a means used by people for social purposes, and on the other hand, they are a representation or embodiment of previous activities. For those means that would potentially be available but are not used at a certain time, the center uses the term reserve instead of resource. So from an anthropological perspective, the term reserve refers in particular to existing but not actively used elements of a local culture. For example, certain networks of Bedouin nomads, or the corpus of knowledge or religious practices of Hindus in India, which are used as soon as major changes or emergency situations, or unstable conditions occur. Here in Germany, in German anthropology, this approach has been elaborated into a separate reserve theory by my colleague Thomas Hauschild in particular. The insight into the capacity of resources to transform within the framework of various dynamics finally led to the question whether it is even reasonable to speak of resources as things or means. The consideration that resources change materially through their use, that they change immaterially also through new ideas and values, had the effect that some of us in this center increasingly understood resources as processes. A simple example, which I of course chose because of the place, at least the virtual place of this conference, might serve as an illustration. Coal is not, as you all know, a given unchangeable natural resource, but is only created from biomass over millions of years and in different phases that produce various, as you better know than me, manifestations of coal. At some point, it is then extracted by humans, partly cleaned and reduced in size, stored, or finally burned with different methods. What exactly coal is, therefore, depends on the place and the time one looks at it. Furthermore, the apparent nature of coal changes with our evolving knowledge. Knowledge about coal, which was valid decades ago, is today already outdated due to new measurement techniques. Understanding resources such as coal as processes, on the one hand, draws our attention to the specific, as we call it, inclinations of matter. It is the changes in substance that cannot be solidly traced back to humans. But on the other hand, it also directs our attention to how we deal with them, which in turn depends on values and knowledge. This means that it is no longer possible to make a clear distinction between research into coal and research into the conditions under which coal is used, which in turn can change as a result of this application, because all of this is closely interrelated. This in turn has mainly to do with the insight that resources never exist in isolation, but are part of networks. Networks consisting of both material and immaterial components or elements. The SFB has coined the term resource complexes for this. The idea is that each resource requires a number of different elements for its use, such as, of course, as you know, people and other living beings, things, materials, norms, forms of knowledge, practice, organizational structures, whatnot. In order to examine these different components more closely, the SFB has defined three cross-sectional areas, as you can see here, that bring research projects from different areas into an interdisciplinary dialogue, for example, on Materialität von Ressourcen, or Bewahren und Vernichten, preservation and destruction, or knowledge. When applying this concept, it turned out that such resource complexes, and this is important, of course, cannot be clearly delimited, because resource complexes are not closed units. It again depends on the perspective of the researchers what is included as a component of such a network, because basically you can extend it, as at least in contemporary times when you have access to all sorts of data. In this respect, the SFB understands resource complexes primarily as an analytical tool. For what? For grasping the relationships between a resource and the elements that are used to handle it. In principle, these elements are also resources, of course, in the sense of the center. There is no fundamental epistemological difference between resources and the components of the resource complex. Rather, it is once again a question of perspective. If one component is considered a resource, this then determines the entire research design, because this focus makes very specific meanings, evaluations, functions, and connections visible. For example, an ethno-archaeological sub-project is concerned with the so-called Dehesa landscape of the Andalusian Sierra Morena. The anthropological project with the doctoral student Mike Mellis has gradually uncovered a complex in this landscape in which the famous Iberico pig, you probably all know Iberico ham, is the central resource. The culture-specific treatment of these pigs directed our research attention to the cork and home oaks, which you see here in the back of the picture, whose acorns are their food source, to the dry soil and grass under these trees that make up their habitat, the fences that enclose it, the knowledge of how pork is processed, but also the pig museums and festivals that manifest regional identity and cultural heritage, a very important concept in that area. Of course, this resource complex also includes the modern and economic political infrastructure, which, for example, sets quality standards, regulates trade and much more. This example also shows that the Dehesa landscape is itself a resource, because it preserves the social that has contributed to its creation. I repeat that because it's a difficult idea, but it preserves the social that has contributed to its creation and makes it then a source of new identities. Landscape in general is, of course, not simply a geophysical fact, but presupposes its perception by man, by people, by humans. A landscape, in our view, is a social cultural process influenced by concrete practices of use and design, and also by collective and individual narratives, as I think Thomas is particularly interested in. In a forthcoming essay on landscape as a resource, Martin Bartelheim, Leonardo Garcia San Juan, and I therefore come to the conclusion that landscapes of resources are understood as an expression of collective work, as well as places of remembrance, and as a means of creating social relationships. Landscapes are therefore always in a state of flux, for it is in them that different attributions of meanings and actions become effective. I quote, "The landscape tells, or rather is, a story," as Tim Ingold put it. This statement relates to a very interesting distinction he makes between environment and landscape. For Ingold, an environment offers affordances, means concrete material offers for action. And therefore, according to his argumentation, the environment has concrete functions for human life. Landscapes, on the other hand, according to Ingold, are like bodies. They emerge and change in the process of interaction. Ingold even uses the term embodiment in this context, expressing the idea, or his idea, that bodies like landscapes become, so to say, the visible expression of the relationships and actions that have shaped them. I find that really a very interesting and useful idea. For example, as part of our research project on landscape as resource, Mike Mellis found out that the Sierra Morena dehesas, with their diverse fincas, are an expression of highly unequal private ownership, while the Extremadura dehesas bear witness to the historical struggle of the local population for community rights of use. According to the results of her research, these historical differences determine the perception of the landscape and also affect the measures taken by the population to preserve it. While in the Sierra Morena, for example, only very vague reference is made to a supposedly traditional way of pig farming, and a lot of effort is taken to preserving these fincas, the establishment of cultural heritage in the eastern part of Extremadura is inextricably linked to reclaiming community rights of use, in this case of the century-old cattle drives, the cañedas. In such a resource complex, the animal husbandry in the dehesas consists of learned practices for the use of a resource, of pigs or of sheep, and can be traced back to human planning and purpose-oriented action. The concept of a resource complex is thus helpful to study functional and mechanical relationships in a network of resource use. But it does not really capture unplanned, random, and sudden changes. This concept of resource complex also favors an anthropocentric view, because it starts from the idea that a resource complex is created by human beings, by their use of a particular resource. Now, in order to capture contingencies as well as unplanned effects of the relationships between the elements of such a network, the SFB has therefore taken up theoretical developments from philosophy and cultural studies, and has developed the concept of resource assemblages. Now, you probably know that Deleuze and Guattari originally coined the philosophical term assemblage or agencement in French. The basic idea they followed is that assemblages are arrangements, and these arrangements give a certain coherence, not a total, a certain consistency to very heterogeneous elements. In recent years, assemblage theory has been enriched, as you know, by various intellectual inspirations. Particularly influential were the material turn, the new materialism, you hear more about it tomorrow, I guess, Latour's actor network theory, and Descolar's thought on ontology. The concept of resource assemblages is intended to capture the fact that the components of such a resource network form connections with each other through their different materiality and their different longevity, as well as their specific location in space. And all this develops certain effects often without human planning. For example, climate change, environmental changes, or animal and tree diseases can have an impact on the dehesa landscape I just introduced. But also human-induced developments such as innovations, trade blockades, or conflicts, which might have unforeseen effects on handling of the Iberico pigs. Resource assemblages, I think at least, are also an expression of what has been called the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, die Gleichzeitigkeit des Ungleichzeitigen, wie Ernst Bloch das nannte. It is the interplay of elements of different materiality, temporality, and dynamics which share the same time, but also encapsulate different paths. What does that mean? They are neither simply in contradiction to each other, nor do they form some kind of harmonious whole, but rather create something new through interaction. For example, a new oil pipeline in the great steppes of Central Asia, as Thomas and I know, may and can and is indeed used to rearrange tribal territories of nomads. Or, to give another example from my field, laboratory results of nutritionists on the health benefits of a diet with millet may interact with the ways millet is handled in urban and rural India. Let me briefly elaborate this example. Millet, including sorghum, has, as you see here, recently been advertised as forgotten foods for the future. This in itself is this simultaneity of the non-simultaneous. Under this motto, the Smart Food Initiative of ICRISAT has started to develop new programs to make different types of millet attractive to people in Africa and India. Key economic and political players have all recognized that millet can play a major role in achieving the goals of sustainable development, Millennium Goals, etc. The positive properties of millet for health, well-being, and environment have thus only recently been rediscovered. Now, this triggered a series of new campaigns to promote millet and sorghum as a staple food. As millet is considered usually in India, but also in Africa, to be the food of the poor, a food of the lower caste and of tribal people. Some of these campaigns are now highlighting the nutritional value of this locally inferior millet compared to other cereals and the positive health effects of millet consumption. This, interestingly, leads to an appreciation of millet among the urban elite, who begin to praise millet as superfood. Various NGOs are now committed to promoting millet as nutritionist gain or even wonder grain in the major cities of India, where new shops and restaurants are emerging, offering a range of millet products. In Eastern India, the so-called Odisha Millet Mission began its work and set up special projects. Now, rare varieties of millets are now, and this is really interesting, being searched for in some remote areas, mainly inhabited by the tribal population. Suddenly, so completely unforeseen, those previously despised tribal people are now being raised to, as you see here, the status of guardians of millets. Laboratory scientists in the USA and mountain dwellers in the highlands of India share the same present, and now through these developments, their different histories are put in relation to each other, triggering amazing processes. These findings and concepts are the result of the first two funding phases of this center. From the very beginning, the focus was on one goal that is firmly anchored, as you see in the title of this center, the study of resource cultures. Now, what is meant by this? In recent decades, the reification of self-contained cultures that are more than the totality of their parts and that can be described independently of each other has rightly come under criticism in archaeology as well as in anthropology and in history. Now, research into individual cultures has been replaced by studies on their interdependencies or entanglements, the histoire croisée. Now, cultural interaction is nowadays more or less understood as a continuum in which various possibilities for action exist between passive imitation or active appropriation. The possibilities of resistance and subversion are taken into account. Creativity, as you see here, innovation, selective appropriation, active transformation, contextualization, all this has been recognized as part of cultural transformation processes. Cultural interaction is therefore no longer understood primarily as a kind of process of homogenization and the emergence of coherent cultural units. However, even these approaches, I think, could not fundamentally overcome the idea that it is somehow cultures that interact and become interwoven. The perspective changed, however, in that more attention was now paid to the connections between the elements, and thus, for example, infrastructures and their effects became the focus of research. Cultural units were replaced by research on the cultural dimensions, I should say. It is the effect of cultural attributions of meaning from various sources on the distribution of things, the attribution of identities, or the legitimation of power relations. Can these approaches be applied to archaeological data? I think yes, although I'm only an anthropologist. For example, some years ago, I read an interesting article by Sylviane Scharl from the University of Cologne. I think she presented it in Bochum. Her paper is about the form and distribution of flint in northwestern Bavaria during the early and middle Neolithic. She describes the various aspects of handling of flint. It is what we in the SFB would call a resource complex. This includes the extraction of silex, the production of knives from the raw material, the use of this material to improve or reuse tools, and the distribution and exchange of silex. All these are actions that require social relations and communication, sometimes over long distances, and she can show that this existed. She discusses how one type of flint, the so-called Plattenhornstein of Abensberg-Arnhofen, became increasingly important, while others were apparently used less and less. In the words of the SFB, this Plattenhornstein flint silex thus became a resource. Her text suggests that this had to do with the development of spatial centers such as circular earthworks throughout Middle Europe. The prominence of Plattenhornstein could therefore be an indication that there is a cultural value attribution here, which according to Sylviane Scharl's thesis makes flint a symbolic resource for the creation of cultural identity. From the perspective of the SFB, Charles' findings could be used to illustrate the concept of resource cultures. Now, the term resource culture, or in German Ressourcenkultur, was used earlier in Germany by a group of economists working on innovations for resource efficiency and cultures of trust in small and medium-sized enterprises, as you can see here. Interestingly, they even wrote it in the same way as we did, but we didn't know of each other at that time. Among them, one author named Moldaschel has developed an approach to resource cultures in 2012 already, so 1 year before we started, which has certain similarities with the concepts I just presented, because it also emphasizes the importance of culture and history, of practice and collective work. You can read it here, I give the reference. In the context of the SFB, resource cultures are not real entities. Rather, the term aims to generalize the relationships between three components, namely resources, resource use, and dynamics of social cultural groups and identity. A look at the interplay of these three aspects should make it possible, on the one hand, to work out the specific developments in concrete spaces, on the other hand, to achieve comparability. Now, as you know, comparisons highlight both differences and similarities. Resource cultures that have emerged at different times and in different spaces can nevertheless have distinct features. For example, it can be asked why some resource cultures are particularly short or long-lived, why they are spatially limited or very expensive, why they have a socially stabilizing or strongly differentiating effect. Now, I skip the last example and come to an end because I see that I have been given 1 hour to talk and I have to come to an end now. So these mechanisms of resource cultures, which I have described, can be used to illustrate what a resource culture is. For us, it combines the following cultural dimensions. First, the meanings, values, and ideas that make something a resource. Second, the specific handling of these resources is the concrete use is cultural. And thirdly, the processes of social change that result from the handling of resources is also cultural. And this together makes the resource culture. Thank you very much. I have come to an end. Thanks for listening. And I hope I didn't take too long. Thank you.
Sure, we all should clap, and you should hear the clapping through all the
okay.
virtual audience. Okay, thank you very much, Roland. It was an inspiring talk, of course. Many interesting concepts, and I guess we will have many questions and debates, not only today, possibly also the next 2 days and even the other sessions. I would suggest to write a question if you like to raise a question, please write it to the chat and I will distribute it then, because otherwise I wouldn't see who is going to ask a question. So I do not know who wants to start, but if so, please give a comment to the chat and I can see it. So at the moment I don't see anyone. Yeah, there is Sui Agilidis who starts. Okay, Sui, please.
Thank you very much. It was very, very dense. I'm not quite familiar with these subjects, but nevertheless, just to comment, you were talking at the beginning about the this resource definition, and I was quite thrilled to hear about this connection with the Earth concerning the resurrection and the resources. And Thomas is smiling because he knows what I'm going to say, because I'm working on the god of the underworld, Hades, and it seems that this thought to see the Earth in a relationship to the resources, as we say today, and to death and of course the resurrection is quite old. So thank you very much for that. I didn't know this connection.
Thank you. Yes, I must say it doesn't go back to myself. I attended your archaeological conference in Barcelona some years ago, and there was one archaeologist, and she said to me, have you ever thought about this, that Jesus emerged from the grave, so from the ground, and now we take all these highly valuable resources also from the ground? And I thought, yes, this is a really good idea. I have to look up who she is, so whenever I will publish this, I will refer to her.
Okay, thank you, Sui, for the question. So we have Matteo Cantisani. Where is Matteo? Oh, here. You have to unmute, Matteo. We couldn't. Can't hear? Cannot hear you.
Sorry. Yes. So also, I was also thinking about the history of the world resources through time, and what was interesting was a kind of evolution which appears from your talk, from as Soy also said, kind of more naturally entrenched concept towards a concept which is more linked to the economic aspect of life, which basically actually we start looking at resources in a Cartesian way to an extent, no? So we have the humans on one side, and then we have the resources on the other side. And then you ended up with a new material turn, which basically brings, again, humans and resources together in a kind of meshwork, in a kind of network. So my question is, according to this new turn, it is possible also that this kind of redefinition of new materialist redefinition of resources can help us in thinking about more sustainable way of looking at the environment, its transformation, and our interrelationship with the environment?
I guess if you ask the speaker of the SFB, he would immediately say yes, because such a thing would give importance, practical importance to our research. But if you ask me now, I think this would be not the aim of redefining resources for me. My aim was to overcome our ethnocentrism, to overcome this idea that we know what resources are and we simply apply it to everybody else, to the Neolithic as well as to Indian tribals. So my initial interest was to understand how would it be possible to to keep the idea of resources without all this luggage, this baggage from industrial times. And so the solution was to say each society, depending on its social structure, has its own resources, and this makes it a resource. And the societies are encapsulated also in these resources. And this suddenly opens our research to all societies in past and present, because it allows us to search for something that is not predefined in any way, but emerges from the research. And when you ask for sustainability and so on, I would again say these are more or less first of all, our ethnocentric questions. It is what we struggle with. We see climate change, we see all this change, and so we define something as sustainable and then say this is good for us. So these are our debates here, everywhere, on conferences, in politics, in newspapers, everywhere it's about sustainability. But this was not in the mind of the people, for example, I worked with in India, maybe among the urban people and the academics and so on. They also think about sustainability, but not the tribal people in the forests I lived with. So I wanted to learn what are their topics about their resources.
Well, actually, I think this is a nice observation, well, in the sense that I had a couple of readings also about tribal experiments to an extent to manage the landscape. So helping, for instance, the reforestation of certain traits. These were more kind of African studies, if I remember well. So I guess there may be some community non-complex that can be interested in this kind. And for this reason, I think that it can be also applied to the study of the past to an extent, because climate change has always happened, actually.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm just saying you can, of course, ask if these tribals' life ways are sustainable or non-sustainable. Both kinds of researches are done. It is just not the question I would appreciate, because I want to understand how they treat their resources. And what are their discourses, so to say, about this? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. So we have Mark Pierce. He's next to the row. Mark, where are you? I don't see you.
Hello, I'm
here.
Can
Hi,
you
Mark.
see me now?
Wow, wonderful.
I thought that was a really quite stimulating paper. Thank you very, very much, Roland. There's one question I really wanted to ask about how you perceive of certain types of resource. So you talked to us about the fundamental difference between a resource and a reserve. A reserve, if I understood rightly, being a resource that is there, but we don't use it. But of course, we don't always know what the resources are that are available to us. And that can happen in two ways. They can either be resources that we just don't perceive of. So, for example, in a society that doesn't know metal, they don't perceive of the availability of copper ore. And I'm sure you understand that's why I'm asking this question. There's another form of resource that we don't necessarily perceive, and that is a resource we haven't yet discovered. So in the Ruhr, before the coal was discovered, the resource was there. The people knew what it was, but they didn't know it was under their feet. So how do you perceive that difference? What is for your SFB, what is the difference between a resource that I would recognize if I know it was there, and a resource that I wouldn't recognize because I don't have the knowledge or the technology to recognize that resource? Have you thought about that issue?
Thank you. Yes. For example, I lived among the Kyrgyz people in Central Asia for quite some time. 1 year at the second highest mountain lake in the world, the so-called Isikul, full of fish and so on. So the Kyrgyz, however, do not, at least in the past, eat fish. Nowadays they do, but we certainly know that they never did fishing and refused to eat this fish, because for them this looked like frogs, they say nowadays, and they don't like frogs either. So I wouldn't call this then a resource. It's just something, some raw material or whatever, a thing, an object, a living being, but it's not a resource in our sense of the term, because first, it is not used, and second, it is also not represented in this by these people in artistic or material forms. It has not much to do with their daily social interactions because they don't eat, they don't prepare fish. So it is just no resource. And it's also not a reserve because it has never been accepted or recognized as something valuable in their lives. So the distinction between reserve and resource is rather that something which used to be valuable in a society and which is perhaps reserved in myths, legends, oral traditions, and so on. For example, certain migration routes in the Sahara or so, yeah, might at the moment not be of any importance to this society, but there might come a time when, yeah, a war starts and they are turned back to certain areas that suddenly this knowledge becomes a resource again. Yeah. So in a way, there are no resources that you can define without studying the society and the people's social interactions first. Yeah. That would be my answer. I don't know if it's convincing, but thanks, Mark, for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, we have Gary in the next row. Gary Su. Where is Gary? Oh, here. Hi.
Yes, I'm Yumi. Hello, thank you. It's very inspiring talk and like it made me think a lot. And although my children are very loud in the background, but my question is like you showed the picture of this gold like ornament in these Indian tribes, and it's come to me a fact like, is that possible? Like even in the central, the different cultural group, they have different perception of resource. For example, the gold itself is not the resource for people who are actually using. When they go into an object, they become a resource. Rather than the gold itself is the resource, because when you look at the ore, it's very dirty, it's not impure, and for people with actual consumption, for people actually use the gold, they prefer to. If the gold turn into object, they regard them as a resource. Have you considered this, or have you touched upon this kind of transformation of resource based on different like target groups?
I didn't get it exactly. So you're asking the difference between gold ore and gold.
Yes.
In its manufactured form.
Yes, like for example, it's easier for example, we have the smartphone nowadays, and I cherish as my resource, very important resource I get. But I don't care. But it doesn't matter whether what they made it and what's the material come from. So we have no knowledge about this material itself. We just know the product itself is good for us. Like for example, the gold as well. Like gold itself is not. Of course, it's very precious, but it's become very valuable resource for people when they turn into certain ritual objects.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So in India, at least traditional India, there used to be a whole caste of goldsmiths who were the experts for making gold, and most people, especially women, are quite aware about different qualities of gold, and they especially accept one type of this yellow gold as a preferred substance for making jewelry. But the knowledge about substance might be different in Indian society. Some know a lot about it, some do not. But this is not the most important thing. From my point of view, what makes gold such a resource in India. As I mentioned, yeah, the largest consumer of private households of gold in the world. That must have a reason. And it's not the substance as in its different forms, but it's the idea that gold is extremely pure and indestructible. And thus it becomes a representation of divinity, and of the highest social value in the caste system, which is purity. And this is the only, I think, explanation why gold, even nowadays, is purchased by so many people and kept in all their households and used in all these rituals. And by the way, it's not the tribal people, it's the Hindu majority. We're talking about 1 billion people here, yeah, Hindus who have the highest gold reserves in private households in the world.
But I would raise a question. And you said a little bit about resource complexes. You explained your term resource complexes. And then you came to the point that, for instance, it's we have relevant resources. You define relevant resources. And I'm asking myself if, for instance, this dominating resources, okay, there is a special perception, it's a special cultural embedding in it, there's no doubt. So what I'm asking, okay, it has to do with also appropriation processes, not only culturally embedded, also by getting experiences, by appropriating environment, etc. So like Ingold also expects, tells us. But did you also discuss a bit more in your SFB the question of forgetting these resources? You know, you have a complex culture. You say about, okay, we have a dominant relevant resource, but of course we do see through the history of humankind that resources are also forgotten. They came out of practice because of certain reason. You talked, I was inspired by the aspect of, you called it unforeseen aspects with these resource assemblages. But did you theorize these questions a bit more on the how to leave the paths, the paths of knowledge, then of practice, to forget these things, because we have many examples, of course, in our material world. Yeah.
No, I think not so much. So you could use it for your SFB to develop this idea. I think we haven't touched so much on this idea of forgetting. It's a little bit in this reserve idea I just mentioned, but we haven't studied reserves a lot. We did do some work on the destruction of resources. And of course, especially the archaeologists and historians, they see the long durée, the long-term changes, but the focus is always more on what is there than what has been forgotten and how it has been forgotten. So I think, no, we haven't done much on this. Yeah.
Because as you said, the perception might be quite different, you know, between different societies, and even it must not be culturally embedded. It's just, you know, like you consider one thing as a color, and as we have also with our material cultures, for instance, metal, you perceive it as a metal property, or not as a color, yeah, and we do have it, and and I think this is an interesting interplay, isn't it?
No, absolutely, yes, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, do we have other questions? So if not, Roland, we thank you very much again. So it was, I guess, very interesting.
For invitation, but also for staying with me here. I checked at the beginning, there were 63 or something. There's still 60 people around listening. I feel very honored. Thanks for this patience, and have a good evening, and see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow with the conference. Of course, everybody is interested is invited. And tomorrow morning at 9, Tim Lequin from Montana State University, he will be in the evening and we will be in the morning. So we'll talk to us, and hopefully also we have good discussions further on. Roland, thank you very much. It was
a very
pleasant time with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.